The wind was a bitter preacher, howling a sermon of grit and dust across the plains. It whipped the brim of Eli Thatcher's hat against his brow and tore at the worn fabric of his duster. He rode hunched against it, his shoulders a familiar landscape of weariness. His horse, a steady buckskin named Ghost, plodded onward with the grim determination of an animal that knew its rider's soul. Before them, nestled in a crease of the desolate earth like a festering wound, lay the town of Blackwater. It was less a town and more a collection of resentments held together by mud and timber. A place where hope came to die and decent men did not linger. Eli was not looking for decency, only for supplies and a barrier against the storm that was bruising the western sky. The clouds gathered in shades of slate and charcoal, promising a deluge that would turn the prairie into a sea of mud. He needed oats for Ghost, flour and coffee for himself, and perhaps a roof that did not leak for a night or two. That was all. He had learned long ago to keep his needs simple. The world had a way of punishing a man for wanting more. He guided Ghost down the town's single, sorry excuse for a street. It was a rutted track of mire and filth, flanked by clapboard buildings that leaned against each other for support. Men with hard eyes and holstered guns watched him from the covered porch of the saloon, their gazes lingering on his rifle, his saddlebags, the cut of his jaw. He was a stranger, and in a town like Blackwater, a stranger was either a threat or a victim. Eli had no intention of being the latter. He dismounted in front of the general store, the leather of his saddle groaning in the sudden quiet. The store was a dim, cluttered space that smelled of salted pork, old wood, and the faint, sweet decay of rotting produce. An old man with a cloud of white hair and suspicious eyes measured out his supplies, his movements slow and deliberate. "Storm's coming up mean," the storekeeper grumbled, his voice like gravel in a bucket. "Gonna be a bad one." Eli nodded, his gaze sweeping over the meager offerings. "I've seen worse." "Staying at the boarding house?" "Figured I'd find a livery. The horse needs a dry stall more than I need a soft bed." The old man grunted, a sound that could have been agreement or dismissal. "Livery's next to the saloon. Can't miss it, or the trouble that comes with it." Eli paid the man, his movements economical, his face unreadable. He had no interest in trouble, but he knew it had a way of finding him all the same. He carried his supplies to the livery, a rickety barn that smelled of damp hay and manure. After settling Ghost in a stall with a generous portion of oats, he stood for a moment, listening to the rising shriek of the wind. The air was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the low hum of human misery, a frequency he was all too familiar with. Drawn by a need for a hot meal and a cup of coffee that wasn't boiled over his own campfire, he made his way toward the saloon. The place was called the Bottom Dollar, a fitting name for an establishment where everything, including a man's dignity, seemed to be for sale. The noise from within spilled out into the street, a tinny piano, coarse laughter, and the sharp crack of a dispute ending as quickly as it began. He pushed through the bat-wing doors and was met with a wall of heat, smoke, and the sour stench of spilled whiskey. The room was crowded with rough men, miners, drifters, and hard-bitten ranch hands, all nursing drinks and staring into the middle distance with the vacant eyes of those who had seen too much and felt too little. Eli found an empty table in a dark corner, a spot where he could watch the room without being the center of attention. A woman with a tired, painted face brought him a plate of stew and a mug of coffee. He thanked her, and she gave him a flicker of a smile that did not reach her eyes before drifting away. He ate slowly, his senses on high alert. Something was wrong. The usual drunken boisterousness of a frontier saloon was edged with a different kind of energy, a predatory, expectant buzz. He saw men exchanging knowing glances, passing coins from hand to hand under the tables. They were waiting for something. His question was answered when a burly man with a face like a slab of raw meat cleared a space near the back of the room. Another man, thin and weaselly, with a slicked-down curtain of greasy hair, stepped into the clearing. "All right, gentlemen, settle down, settle down," the weaselly man announced, his voice oozing a false congeniality. "For those of you with discerning tastes and heavy pockets, Silas is pleased to present a private offering, a chance to acquire some prime assets, direct from the East." A murmur of crude excitement went through the room. Eli's hand, which had been resting on the table, slowly moved to his lap, closer to the Colt peacemaker holstered at his hip. His stomach tightened into a cold knot. He had stumbled into it again, the foulest trade the West had to offer. The burly man, Silas, disappeared through a back door and returned a moment later, shoving a woman before him. She was young, no more than 20, with faded calico and fear in her eyes. She stumbled into the clearing, catching herself before she fell. "First up," the auctioneer chirped, "is Mary, a fine worker, strong back, knows her way around a kitchen, and I'm told she's agreeable. Who'll start the bidding for this fine piece of domestic help?" Men shouted numbers, their voices thick with liquor and lust. Eli watched, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. The stew turned to ash in his mouth. He felt the familiar, sickening crawl of rage build in his chest. A cold fire he had carried for years. He had seen this before, in dusty outposts and lawless boom towns. He had seen women paraded like cattle, their spirits broken, their humanity stripped away until all that was left was a trembling shell. Mary was sold for $60 to a grizzled miner who grinned, showing a mouthful of brown, rotten teeth. He grabbed her arm and dragged her away, her face a mask of numb resignation. Another woman was brought out, then a third. Each time, the bidding was quick and brutal, a transaction of flesh and silver that left a stain on the very air in the room. Eli did not move. He sat like a stone statue in the corner, his coffee growing cold, his presence unnoticed. He was just another shadow in a room full of them. He should have left. He should have walked out that door, mounted his horse, and ridden into the teeth of the storm. It was not his fight. He could not save them all. He had learned that lesson in the cruelest way imaginable. And then Silas brought out the last girl. She was younger than the others, perhaps only 17. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and a dark, ugly bruise marred the pale skin of her cheekbone. Her hair, the color of corn silk, was matted and hung in limp strands around her face. But it was her eyes that seized him. She kept them fixed on the floorboards, refusing to look at the leering faces around her. Her hands were clenched into small, white-knuckled fists at her sides. She was trembling, a slight, continuous tremor that shook her entire frame. Yet there was something in her posture, a rigid stillness, a refusal to completely break, that spoke of a pride that had not yet been extinguished. "And finally, gentlemen," the auctioneer said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "something truly special. Clara, an orphan, untouched, as pure as the driven snow, a rare flower in this desert, ready for a discerning gardener to tend." A wave of vile laughter and crude comments washed over her. She flinched, her shoulders hunching as if to ward off physical blows. But she did not make a sound. Her silence was more profound than any scream. In that moment, Eli was no longer in a saloon in Blackwater. He was standing by a creek bed, the sun warm on his back, watching his younger sister, Sarah. She had that same corn silk hair, that same stubborn set to her jaw when she was trying to be brave. He saw her face, laughing as she tried to skip a stone across the water. He saw her again. Later, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored the girl's in the center of this filthy room. He saw the same haunted, broken look he had seen in the reflection of his own eyes every morning for the past 5 years. The look of someone who had seen the absolute worst of the world and knew it was coming for them again. "We'll start the bidding for this little dove at $100, the auctioneer declared. "100, a voice roared. "110, shouted another. The numbers climbed quickly. These men were not bidding for a cook or a laundress. Their intentions were plain in their feverish eyes and hungry smiles. Eli felt the cold rage in his chest ignite into a white-hot inferno. It burned away his caution, his weariness, his desire to remain unseen. Justice was a rare commodity in these parts, but sometimes a man had to make his own. 150. 160. The bidding slowed, the price growing too steep for some. The girl, Clara, remained motionless, a statue of terror. $170. A rancher with a sprawling gut slurred, placing a stack of coins on a nearby table. And she's mine. The auctioneer grinned, his eyes gleaming. 170. A fine price for such a prize. Going once. A chair scraped against the floor in the corner. Every head turned as Eli Thatcher rose to his feet. He was not a large man, but he stood with a straight-backed stillness that commanded attention. His face, shadowed by the brim of his hat, was a mask of cold fury. 200, he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the din of the saloon like a razor. A surprised silence fell over the room. The auctioneer's greasy smile faltered for a second. The fat rancher scowled, his face turning a blotchy red. "Who the hell are you?" the rancher demanded. Eli ignored him, his eyes fixed on the auctioneer. $200. In gold. The mention of gold sent another ripple through the room. The rancher grumbled, counted his remaining money, and spat on the floor. 210. 300, Eli said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He did not even look at his competitor. He was looking at the girl. For the first time, she lifted her head, her wide, frightened eyes meeting his from across the room. They were the color of a stormy sky, filled with a confusion that warred with her terror. The saloon was dead quiet now, save for the howl of the wind outside. The men stared, their drunken amusement replaced by a tense curiosity. This was no longer about the girl. It was a contest of wills. The rancher slammed his fist on the table. "He's bluffing. He ain't got that kind of money." Without taking his eyes off Clara, Eli reached into his duster and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He tossed it onto the bar, where it landed with a solid, definitive thud. The clink of coins was unmistakable. "There's more than 300 there," Eli stated calmly. "Take what's owed. The rest is for a bottle of your best whiskey. I expect to drink it in peace." The auctioneer's eyes widened at the sight of the pouch. Greed won out over any allegiance he might have had to the other bidder. He snatched the pouch from the bar. "Sold!" he cried, his voice triumphant. "To the quiet gentleman in the back." A low murmur of laughter and mockery rose from the crowd. They looked Eli up and down, their expressions a mixture of derision and envy. They thought they knew why he had paid such a price. They saw a lonely drifter buying himself a companion for the long, cold nights ahead. They saw a man indulging a dark appetite. They did not see the ghost of a dead sister standing behind him. They did not see the righteous fury that had driven him to this act. Eli walked forward, his boots sounding loud on the wooden floor. The crowd parted for him. He stopped in front of the girl, who flinched back, her eyes dropping to the floor once more. She was trembling more violently now. He had not saved her. He had simply become her new owner. He turned to Silas. "Untie her," he commanded. Silas, looking sullen, fumbled with the rope that bound her wrists. The moment she was free, she cradled her chafed skin, shrinking into herself. Eli did not touch her. He simply nodded toward the door. "Come on," he said, his voice softer than before, but still firm. He turned and walked away, not looking back to see if she was following. He trusted that fear would be a sufficient leash. He pushed through the bat-wing doors and back into the biting wind. The sky was almost black now, and the first drops of cold rain were beginning to fall. He heard her footsteps behind him, light and hesitant on the muddy street. He led the way to the livery, the eyes of the town on their backs. He could feel their sneers, hear their whispered jokes. Let them talk. Their opinions were worth less than the mud on his boots. Inside the relative quiet of the barn, he lit a lantern, its golden glow pushing back the shadows. He pointed to a small wagon he had parked in the corner, one he used for carrying extra supplies. The bed was filled with clean straw and covered with a canvas tarp. "You can sleep there," he said, not looking at her. He busied himself with checking on Ghost, running a hand down the horse's flank. "It's dry. No one will bother you." He turned back to find her standing exactly where she had stopped, just inside the doorway, looking like a lost fawn poised for flight. He grabbed a spare wool blanket from his saddle roll and tossed it into the wagon bed. Then he opened one of his new sacks, took out a loaf of bread and a piece of dried jerky, and set them on a crate near the wagon. "Eat," he said. It was an order, not a suggestion. She said nothing. She did not move. Her silence was a wall, thick and impenetrable. He could see the terror radiating from her, so potent he could almost taste it. She was afraid to trust him, and he could not blame her. In her world, a man's kindness was just another kind of trap. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice low and rough. He felt a frustrating inadequacy. He knew how to handle a gun, how to track a man for 100 miles, how to survive in the harshest wilderness. He did not know how to gentle a terrified girl. She finally moved, scuttling over to the wagon like a crab and climbing in, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. She curled into the far corner, making herself as small as possible, a bundle of misery in the flickering lantern light. She did not touch the food. Eli sighed, a long, weary exhalation of breath. He took his rifle from its scabbard, checked the load, and sat down on a hay bale near the livery doors, his back to the wall. He would keep watch. The storm broke then, the rain coming down in a driving, relentless torrent, drumming against the roof of the barn. It was a fitting sound for the tempest in his own soul. He stared out into the black, churning night, the rifle resting across his knees. He saw the girl, Clara, huddled in the wagon out of the corner of his eye. Her shaking had subsided to a slight, intermittent shudder, like an animal that had survived a predator's attack but was not yet sure the danger had passed. He closed his eyes, and the image of Sarah rose to meet him, sharp and painful as a knife wound. Her bright, trusting smile, the way she had looked up to him, her protector, her big brother. He remembered the day the riders had come, their faces cruel and empty. He had been too slow, too young, too weak. He had tried to protect her, but he had failed. They had taken her, and by the time he and the posse had found their camp, it was too late. All that was left was the deafening silence where her laughter used to be. He had carried that failure with him ever since, a weight that settled deep in his bones, heavier than any saddle or pack. He opened his eyes and looked at Clara again. He saw the same vulnerability, the same haunted emptiness in her gaze that he remembered in Sarah's. He had failed his sister. He would not fail this girl. It was a vow he made to the ghost in his memory, a silent promise whispered into the heart of the storm. They did not speak again. The night wore on, a long, dark passage of time marked only by the drumming of the rain and the howl of the wind. He kept his watch, a solitary sentinel guarding a broken girl, while she remained curled in the wagon, a silent, trembling testament to the cruelty of the world. They were two strangers, thrown together by a moment of desperate righteousness, trapped in a fragile shelter while the unforgiving wilderness raged around them, and, in the oppressive silence, surrounded by the storm. Eli Thatcher felt the profound and aching loneliness of a man trying to outrun a past that was always, and forever, right at his heels. The storm passed with the dawn, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of damp earth and sage. The sky was a pale, fragile blue, and the first rays of sun set the wet plains shimmering. Eli had not slept. He had watched the night recede, his rifle a constant, cold weight in his hands. When the light was strong enough, he rose, his joints stiff, and began the morning ritual of making coffee. He moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of a life lived alone. He did not look toward the wagon where the girl, Clara, was hidden, but he was aware of her every potential movement. He had placed the food out for her the night before, and it remained untouched. He expected nothing different this morning. Trust was not a seed that sprouted overnight, especially not in poisoned soil. He was tending to Ghost, checking a loose shoe, when a small sound made him pause. It was the creak of the wagon bed. He did not turn, but his body went still. Every muscle coiled. He heard a soft rustling, then the light thud of feet hitting the barn floor. He continued his work, his movements measured, giving her space. He could feel her watching him. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. Finally, a voice, small and raspy from disuse, broke the quiet. "Why?" It was just one word, fragile as a bird's wing. Eli stopped what he was doing and slowly straightened up. He turned to face her. She stood by the wagon, the oversized blanket still clutched around her shoulders like armor. The morning light caught in her pale hair, and the bruise on her cheek seemed a darker, more violent purple than it had in the lantern's glow. Her eyes, those pools of stormy gray, were fixed on him, filled with a desperate, fearful curiosity. He considered his answer. He could tell her about Sarah. He could try to explain the rage and the guilt that were the twin engines of his heart. But those were his burdens, not hers. And words like that, from a stranger, would mean nothing. They would sound like an excuse, or worse, a lie. So he gave her the only truth that mattered. He met her gaze directly, his own eyes clear and steady. "So no one else could," he said. The answer hung in the air between them. Her brow furrowed in confusion. She had been property her entire life, a thing to be passed from one hand to another. The idea that someone would purchase her simply to remove her from the market was a concept so foreign it had no place to land in her understanding of the world. She said nothing more, but the hard knot of terror in her expression loosened. Just a fraction, replaced by a profound and unsettling bewilderment. They left Blackwater without a word to anyone. Eli packed his supplies, hitched Ghost to the wagon, and led them out of that sorry town and back into the vast, empty expanse of the plains. He set a steady pace, heading south and west, toward the jagged teeth of distant mountains. For the first few days, the silence returned, a heavy blanket that smothered all but the essential sounds of travel. The creak of the wagon wheels, the plod of Ghost's hooves, the sigh of the wind across the grasslands. Clara rode in the back of the wagon, a silent observer. She watched him, studying his every move. She saw the way he scanned the horizon, his eyes missing nothing. She saw the careful way he cleaned his rifle each evening, the practiced, lethal grace of his hands. She saw that he always took the first watch at night, sitting with his back against a rock, a lonely silhouette against the firelight. He never approached her, never spoke unless necessary, and always left her portion of food by the fire before retreating to his own space. He treated her not as a prisoner, nor as a companion, but as a wounded animal he was cautiously trying not to spook. Slowly, a change began. It started with small things. One morning, she gathered dried buffalo chips for the fire before he did. Another day, she took the skillet from his pack and had it cleaned before he could reach for it. Eli acknowledged these gestures with a slight nod, a silent recognition that a boundary was being crossed, a tentative step being taken. One afternoon, as they stopped to water the horse at a shallow creek, she spoke again. "I can cook better than you," she said. Her voice was still quiet, but the rasp was gone. Eli looked at the charred bacon and hard biscuits from their morning meal. A faint, almost imperceptible twitch played at the corner of his mouth. That wouldn't be hard, he admitted. From then on, she took over the cooking. Her meals were simple but savory, a welcome change from his own grim fare. The shared act of preparing and eating food began to chip away at the wall of silence between them. Her questions, when they came, were short and guarded. "Where are we going?" she asked one evening, staring into the flames of the campfire. "To a place to rest for a bit," he answered, not elaborating. "Are you a lawman?" "No." "A bounty hunter?" He hesitated for a moment. "Sometimes." His answers were clipped, but they were honest. She began to piece together a picture of the man who had bought her freedom. He was quiet, solitary, and carried a sadness so deep it seemed a part of his very bones. But he was also kind, in his own distant way. He made sure she had the thicker blanket, the shadier side of the wagon, the first cup of coffee. It was a language of actions, not words, but she was beginning to understand it. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, the land grew rougher, the trail less certain. One day, a rattlesnake startled Ghost, and the horse shied violently, nearly overturning the wagon. Clara was thrown clear, landing hard in the dust. Eli had the horse under control in an instant, his voice low and calming. He was at her side a second later, his face etched with a concern he could not hide. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hand hovering over her shoulder, not quite touching her. She shook her head, breathless and shaken, but uninjured. The incident seemed to decide something for him. That evening, after their meal, he opened a small wooden box he kept in his saddlebags. He took out a small, pearl-handled lady's pistol, a derringer. It was small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. "You should know how to use this," he said, his tone all business. He showed her how to load it, how to aim, how to pull the trigger without flinching. He set up a tin can on a rock 50 feet away. Her first shot went wide, the kick of the small gun surprising her. The noise of it echoed in the vast silence. "Again," he said patiently. She tried again, and again. He stood behind her, correcting her stance, telling her to breathe, to squeeze the trigger gently. He did not touch her, but his presence was a steady, calming force. On her 6th shot, she hit the can, sending it flying off the rock with a satisfying ping. A small, involuntary smile touched her lips, the first he had ever seen. It was a fleeting thing, but it transformed her face, giving him a glimpse of the girl she might have been. "Just in case," he said, his voice gruff as he took the pistol to clean it. "In case I'm not around." The implication hung in the air. The world was dangerous, and he might not always be there to stand between her and its dangers. He was giving her a weapon, a choice, a chance. He was teaching her how to protect herself. It was the most profound gift she had ever received. She also started noticing things about him, little things. The way his hand would sometimes tremble when he was drinking his coffee. A fine, barely perceptible tremor he would quickly hide by setting the cup down. It usually happened when he was staring off into the distance, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. She saw the network of old scars on his knuckles, the faded white lines of a hard life, and she saw the exhaustion in his eyes when he thought she was not looking, a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with the miles they traveled. After 2 weeks of hard riding, they crested a ridge and looked down into a small, sheltered valley. A creek snaked through a meadow of tall grass, and nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees was a small, dilapidated ranch house with a leaning barn beside it. "This is it," Eli said. "We can lay low here for a while." "Why are we laying low?" she asked. "Heard talk in the last town of a bounty hunter named Jedediah Kane. He's tracking a gang of outlaws in this territory. Kane's the kind of man who shoots first and asks questions later. I'd rather not cross his path." The explanation felt incomplete, but she did not press him. The ranch had been empty for a long time. The wood was weathered to a silver gray, and the windows were dark and vacant. Eli explained that it had belonged to a friend of his, a man he had fought alongside in the war. The friend had died of fever 2 years back, and his wife had taken their child and gone back east. The place had been left to Eli, though he had never come to claim it until now. It was a sad, lonely place, but it offered shelter. They spent the first day making it habitable, sweeping out the thick layers of dust and chasing out the pack rats that had taken up residence. The house consisted of one large room with a stone hearth, a small bedroom off to the side, and a lean-to kitchen. Eli took the main room, leaving the bedroom for her. The unspoken boundary between them remained firmly in place, while Eli worked on reinforcing the corral and patching the roof of the barn. Clara found herself drawn to exploring the abandoned house. It was like a tomb, filled with the ghosts of a happy life abruptly ended. In the bedroom, she found a small, leather-bound book of poetry on a dusty nightstand. In a rickety chest of drawers, she discovered a tangle of faded ribbons and a piece of yellowed lace. She ran the delicate fabric through her fingers, imagining the woman who had worn it. But it was the discovery in a small, carved wooden box at the back of a closet that truly unsettled her. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a pair of tiny, scuffed baby shoes. She picked one up, her fingers tracing the worn leather. They were so small, so impossibly small. A life had begun here. A family had been built within these walls. Laughter had once echoed in this now silent room. She felt a profound and aching sense of loss, not just for the family that had lived here, but for herself, for the childhood she had never had, for the safety and love these small shoes represented. She was both fascinated and deeply disturbed by these remnants of a life she could barely imagine. She felt like an intruder, a ghost haunting another ghost's home. A few nights later, the weather turned. A storm, even more violent than the one that had driven them out of Blackwater, rolled in from the mountains. The wind shrieked around the corners of the small house, and rain lashed against the windows in blinding sheets. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very foundations of the cabin, and lightning lit the room in stark, terrifying flashes of white. Clara sat by the hearth, where Eli had built a roaring fire. She was wrapped in a blanket, but the cold she felt had nothing to do with the temperature. The storm outside was a mirror of the one inside her. Every clap of thunder seemed to shake loose another painful memory. Every flash of lightning illuminated another dark corner of her past. The ghosts of the house were joined by her own. She saw the faces of the men who had owned her, their cruel smiles, their rough hands. She felt the phantom ache of old bruises. The walls of the small house, which had felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. A particularly loud crash of thunder made her jump, and a small, choked sob escaped her lips. She pressed her knuckles to her mouth, trying to stifle the sound, but it was too late. The dam of her control, so carefully constructed over years of silent suffering, finally broke. The tears came, hot and silent at first, then turning into ragged, heaving sobs that shook her entire body. Eli, who had been cleaning his saddle by the firelight, was instantly alert. He set his work aside and watched her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He did not move, giving her a moment, but her breakdown only intensified. Finally, she turned to him, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with an agony that was years in the making. "Will I ever stop feeling like this?" she whispered, her voice raw with pain. "Will I ever stop feeling worthless?" The question struck him with the force of a physical blow. Worthless. It was the word the world had branded on her soul. He saw Sarah in her then, not in her features, but in her brokenness. He saw the end result of all the evil he fought against, embodied in this weeping girl by his fire. He moved then, crossing the space between them in 2 strides. He knelt before her on the stone hearth, so close he could feel the shudders that racked her frame. He looked into her tear-filled eyes, and for the first time, he let her see past the stoic cowboy, past the quiet protector, to the man underneath who understood her pain more than she could ever know. "You're not something to be owned," he said, his voice soft, but with an undercurrent of fierce conviction. It was a truth he willed her to believe, a creed he had lived by, a promise he had made to his sister's memory. His words, so simple and yet so revolutionary to her, broke through her grief. With a desperate cry, she lunged forward, her arms wrapping around his neck, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was trying to tear her apart. She buried her face in his shoulder, her sobs muffled against the rough fabric of his shirt. For a moment, he allowed it. His own arms came up, his hands hovering in the air behind her, not knowing where to land. Her small, trembling body was a fragile weight against his. He felt the years of his own loneliness, his own grief, rise up to meet hers. It would be so easy to hold her, to offer the comfort of an embrace, to let their shared brokenness become a bridge between them. But he could not. He had made a promise to himself, and to her. Gently but firmly, he took her by the shoulders and pulled her away, holding her at arm's length. She looked at him, her face a mess of confusion and fresh hurt. Rejection was a language she understood all too well. Seeing the look in her eyes, he spoke quickly, his voice low and earnest. "I didn't buy you to use you," he said, his gaze intense, forcing her to hear him, to understand. "I just couldn't let them break you." He was not pushing her away out of a lack of feeling. He was pushing her away to prove his point. He was not another man who would take what he wanted from her. He was the man who had bought her freedom, and he would not be the one to put her back in a cage, no matter how gilded. He had to be her protector, not her possessor. In the heart of the raging storm, by the warmth of the fire, he drew a line, not between them, but around her, a line of safety, of respect, of choice, and he would stand guard over it, even if it meant standing guard against himself. The days at the abandoned ranch settled into a quiet rhythm, a fragile peace that felt both welcome and temporary. The silence between Eli and Clara was no longer heavy with fear and mistrust, but filled with a growing, unspoken understanding. He taught her how to mend a fence, and she showed him how to bake bread in the stone hearth that was more even and less burnt than his own attempts. They moved around each other in a careful dance, two solitary souls learning the steps of a shared existence. He was the protector, the quiet guardian, but she was slowly becoming something more. She was becoming a presence, a small flame of life in the desolate landscape of his world. This delicate truce was shattered one sun-drenched afternoon by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Eli was on the porch, oiling a piece of tack, and he was on his feet in an instant, his hand instinctively going to his hip. Clara, who had been tending to a small patch of wild herbs she had found near the creek, froze, her eyes wide and fixed on the trail. A lone rider emerged from the cottonwoods. He was a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a silver star pinned to his vest. He rode with the weary slump of a man who spent too many hours in the saddle and had seen too much trouble. He pulled his horse to a stop in front of the cabin, his eyes taking in Eli, the house, and Clara in one sweeping, professional glance. "Afternoon," the sheriff said, his voice a low rumble. He nodded at Eli. "You must be Thatcher." Eli's face remained a stony mask, but a new tension hardened the lines around his eyes. "That depends on who's asking." "Sheriff?" "Name's Brody. I'm out of Silver Creek, 2 days' ride east of here. Got a telegraph about you from the marshal down in the territory. Said you might have holes up here. Said you might appreciate a warning." Eli did not relax his stance. "A warning about what?" Clara had drifted closer to the cabin, staying near the open door, half hidden in the shadows. She watched the two men, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. The peace was over. The outside world had found them. Sheriff Brody dismounted, the leather of his saddle groaning. "Cole Drayton," he said, the name dropping like a stone into the quiet afternoon. "He and what's left of his gang crossed back over from the northern territories. They hit a stagecoach 2 days ago, left 3 men dead. He's running this way." Eli's body went rigid. It was a subtle change, a tightening of the muscles in his jaw and shoulders. But Clara saw it clearly. It was the stillness of a predator that has caught the scent of its oldest enemy. "I know your history with Drayton," Brody continued, his eyes full of a grim understanding. "The whole territory knows it. He's never forgotten what you did to his brother. If he gets wind you're here, he'll come for you. And he won't come looking for a fair fight." From her vantage point just inside the doorway, Clara listened, her breath caught in her throat. She saw Eli's hand, the one that sometimes trembled, clench into a fist at his side. "I appreciate the warning, Sheriff." Eli's voice was low and strained, each word tight with a control that seemed on the verge of snapping. "It's more than a warning, Thatcher, it's a suggestion. Pack up and ride out. Head further west. There's nothing for you here but a grave." The sheriff's gaze flickered over to Clara, a flicker of pity in his eyes, before returning to Eli. "Especially now that you're not alone." The implication was clear. She was a liability, a weakness. The thought sent a chill of shame through her. Eli's jaw worked, but he said nothing. After a moment, Sheriff Brody seemed to realize he had said all he could. He pulled himself back onto his horse. "You're a hard man to convince, Thatcher. Always were. Just watch your back." With a final, somber nod, the sheriff turned his horse and rode away, disappearing back into the trees, leaving a profound and heavy silence in his wake. Eli stood on the porch for a long time, staring at the spot where the sheriff had vanished. He looked like a man carved from stone, a monument to some long-forgotten tragedy. Clara remained in the doorway, afraid to speak, afraid to move. The name Cole Drayton echoed in her mind. She had heard whispers of him in the rough camps and towns she had passed through, a name synonymous with a particular kind of cruel, senseless violence. Finally, Eli seemed to come back to himself. He turned, and for a moment, his eyes met hers. She saw a storm in them, a tempest of pain and rage, and something that looked terrifyingly like despair. He looked right through her, as if she were a ghost. Without a word, he strode past her into the house, grabbed his rifle, and walked out the back door. Heading for the high ridge that overlooked the valley, he needed to be alone. Clara was left with the crushing silence and the weight of the unspoken. The fragile peace they had built lay in ruins around her. She understood now that his quiet sadness was not just a mood. It was a wound, deep and festering, and the man named Cole Drayton was the salt that had just been poured into it. Later that evening, as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, he returned. He was still silent, his face grim. He ate the meal she had prepared without tasting it, his movements mechanical. The space between them at the small table felt like a chasm. She couldn't bear it any longer. She needed to understand. "Who is he?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "This Cole Drayton?" Eli stopped, his fork halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly and deliberately. He looked at his hands, at the scars on his knuckles, as if reading a story written there. For a long moment, she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, stripped of all emotion. "He's a man who deals in misery. He and his brother, Ethan, they ran a business, taking things that weren't theirs. Horses, money, people." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the table. 5 years ago, they came through my part of the country. They took a woman from a nearby homestead. They took my sister, Sarah. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. Sarah. The name was a key, unlocking a door to a part of him she had never been allowed to see. "I went after them," he continued, his voice flat, reciting a story he had told himself 1,000 times in the dead of night. "Tracked them for 3 days. I found their camp. Ethan was there, with the woman from the homestead. Cole and my sister were gone. I shot Ethan Drayton. I saved the woman." He paused, and a terrible, bitter smile touched his lips. "But I was too late for Sarah. By the time I found where Cole had taken her, it was too late." The story ended, but the words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Clara finally understood. She understood the cold rage in the saloon. She understood the vow in his eyes when he had looked at her bruised face. When he looked at her, he saw his sister. He saw his failure. The weight he carried was not just sadness. It was guilt. Guilt for the sister he could not save. The revelation shifted something inside her. The dynamic between them, so long defined by her vulnerability and his strength, was suddenly altered. She saw his own deep, gaping vulnerability. He was as broken as she was, just in a different way. His scars were on the inside. Seeing his pain gave her the courage to speak of her own, as if by sharing her burden, she could somehow lighten his. "I was raised in a traveling camp," she began, her voice soft. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only other sound in the room. "My PA was a tinker. My ma sold remedies. It wasn't much of a life, but it was mine. We were never in one place for long." Eli listened, his head bowed, his gaze fixed on the fire. He was giving her the space to tell her story, just as she had given him his. "My ma died of a fever when I was 12. Pa, he wasn't the same after that. He started drinking. 2 years later, he fell under the wheels of his own wagon. I was 14. She paused, the memory still sharp. "I was alone." She took a shaky breath. "One of the men in the camp, a gambler my PA owed money to, a man named Silas. He said I belonged to him now, to pay the debt." At the mention of the name Silas, Eli's head snapped up. It was the same man, the burly auctioneer from the saloon in Blackwater. The world was a small, cruel circle. "He sold me to a freighter, who sold me to a saloon owner. It was always the same. I was just a debt to be paid, a piece of property to be traded." She looked down at her own hands, at the faint scars on her wrists. "I tried to run, twice. The first time, they caught me in a day. The punishment was bad. The second time, I got further. I almost made it to a real town, one with a church and a sheriff. They caught me a mile outside of it." She looked up at Eli, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "After that, I stopped trying. It was easier to just be empty, to not hope, because the hope was what hurt the most when they caught you." Their confessions lay between them, 2 raw, open wounds. They were no longer just Eli and Clara, the cowboy and the girl he had saved. They were 2 survivors, 2 people who had been irrevocably broken by the world, now sitting together in the ruins. "I don't believe in redemption," Eli said quietly, his voice thick with a self-loathing that cut her to the core. "Not for myself. All I did was get my sister killed. I can't ever fix that." Clara looked at him, at this man who saw himself as a failure, a sinner beyond saving, and she thought of the saloon, of the moment he had stood up, a lone figure of righteous fury against a room full of ugliness. She thought of the blanket he gave her, the food he offered, the gun he had taught her to use. She thought of his quiet respect, his unwavering refusal to treat her as anything less than a person. "You saved me," she said, her voice clear and certain. He looked at her, startled, as if the thought had never occurred to him. "In that saloon," she continued, leaning forward, "I was already gone. I was empty. I had nothing left. You gave me back something. I don't know what it is yet, but it's not nothing." His expression softened, the hard lines of his face easing for just a moment. Her words had found a crack in the armor of his guilt. He had failed to save his sister, a truth that would haunt him forever. But he had not failed her. It was a single, flickering candle in the vast darkness of his regret. The days that followed were different. The confessions had not magically healed them, but they had cleared the poisoned air. An invisible wall between them had crumbled, replaced by a fragile, tentative intimacy. They talked more, sharing small stories of their pasts that were not steeped in tragedy. A favorite horse, a song a mother used to sing, the taste of wild strawberries. One night, the cabin was quiet except for the gentle whisper of the wind outside. A single candle burned on the table, casting their faces in soft, flickering gold. Eli was staring into the fire, his face troubled. The news of Cole Drayton's return, a constant, heavy weight on his mind. Clara watched him. She saw the tremor in his hand as he lifted his coffee cup. She saw the profound loneliness in his eyes, and she felt a surge of something she had never allowed herself to feel before, a deep, protective tenderness. He had been her guardian for so long. Now, she wanted to offer him comfort. She rose from her chair and walked over to him. He looked up, his eyes questioning as she stopped before him. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted her hand and touched his face. Her fingers were light, tracing the rough line of his jaw. His skin was warm and bristly beneath her touch. It was a simple gesture, but for her, it was a monumental act of will, of choice. She was not being acted upon. She was acting. A shudder went through him at her touch. His eyes closed, and he leaned into her hand, a low groan escaping his lips. All the control, all the rigid discipline he maintained, seemed to melt away in that one moment. He reached up, his larger, rougher hand covering hers, pressing it tighter against his cheek. Then, his other arm went around her waist, pulling her down, not roughly, but with a desperate, undeniable need. He pulled her onto his lap, his face buried in her hair, his body trembling against hers. He held her tightly, as if she were a lifeline. She could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart. It was not the embrace of a master, but of a drowning man. She felt a thrill of fear, but it was quickly overwhelmed by a powerful wave of emotion. She wrapped her own arms around his neck, holding him just as tightly. For a moment, they just stayed there, two broken people clinging to each other in the candlelight. He shifted, his head coming up, his face just inches from hers. His eyes were dark with a raw, wanting hunger that both frightened and thrilled her. He was going to kiss her. She knew it. She wanted him to. But then, something inside him seemed to fight back. The iron will she had come to know so well reasserted itself. His body went tense, and the trembling stopped. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a terrible conflict, a war between his desire and his principles. With a strength that seemed to cause him physical pain, he stopped. He did not push her away, but the energy between them changed. The desperate hunger was replaced by a deep, aching sorrow. He rested his forehead against hers, his voice a ragged whisper. "I won't take what's not freely given." His words were a restatement of his vow, a promise he refused to break. Even now, he would not take advantage of her gratitude, of her vulnerability, of the intimacy of this moment. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the candlelight. She looked at this honorable, tormented man who had saved her life and was now trying to save her soul, even from himself. And she spoke the truest, most heartbreaking words she knew. "I don't know how to be free," she whispered. The concept was as foreign to her as a distant star. Freedom was the absence of chains, but she did not know what to do without them. She did not know how to choose, how to want, how to give of her own accord. Eli pulled back slightly, his hands coming up to cup her face. He looked deep into her eyes, his own gaze full of a fierce, gentle resolve. The conflict was gone, replaced by a profound sense of purpose. He was no longer just her protector. He was her guide. "Then we'll learn together," he said, his voice quiet but unshakable. It was not the passionate declaration of a lover. It was something more profound. It was a promise, a partnership, a pact between two broken souls to find their way out of the darkness, together. The promise to learn freedom together settled over the small valley, a quiet covenant that transformed the days. A delicate, unspoken tenderness grew in the space between Eli and Clara. It was there in the way he started leaving a bucket of fresh water for her on the porch each morning, and the way she began mending the small tears in his shirts. her stitches small and neat. They were like two people learning a new language, not of words, but of small, careful gestures of kindness. They were building something fragile and unnamed in the ruins of the old ranch, a shelter not just from the elements, but from the ghosts that haunted them both. This quiet peace, however, was a luxury the West rarely afforded, and it was destined to be shattered. The attack came at dusk. The sky was awash with the soft, bruised colors of a fading day. Eli was splitting the last of a log pile near the barn, the rhythmic thud of his axe a comforting, domestic sound. Clara was inside, humming a tune she barely remembered, kneading dough for the next day's bread. A sense of calm had settled over her, a feeling so foreign she had to consciously remind herself to breathe it in. The first rifle shot was a whip crack that tore the peaceful evening to shreds. It was not the sound of a hunter. It was the sharp, angry report of a man shooting at a man. Wood splintered violently from the cabin's doorframe, inches from where Clara stood. She screamed, a raw, terrified sound, dropping the dough and stumbling back from the door. Outside, Eli had dropped the axe and drawn his Colt in a single, fluid motion. He dove behind the wood pile as a second shot kicked up dirt where he had just been standing. He peered through a gap in the logs and saw them. Two riders, dismounted and using the cottonwood trees for cover, their rifles leveled at the house. They were not lawmen. They were hard, rough men, the kind who took what they wanted and left bodies behind. They were Cole Drayton's men. He knew it with a sickening certainty. "Thatcher!" one of them yelled, his voice a gravelly sneer. "Drayton sends his regards. He wants the girl, and he wants your hide nailed to a barn door." Eli's blood ran cold. It wasn't just him they were after. They were here for Clara. The thought ignited a cold, focused rage in his chest. He would not let them touch her. He would die here in the dirt before he let that happen. He returned fire, 2 quick shots that sent the men ducking back behind their trees. He used the moment to sprint from the woodpile to the relative cover of the barn's corner. He could hear Clara inside the cabin, her movements frantic. "Clara, stay down!" he yelled, his voice strained. "Stay away from the windows!" A bullet whined past his head, smacking into the weathered barn wood. He risked a glance around the corner. One of the men was trying to circle around, to get a clear shot at the cabin's unprotected rear. Eli aimed, his hand steady despite the pounding of his heart. He squeezed the trigger. The man grunted, staggered back, and fell. He did not get up again. One left, but the remaining gunman was smarter. He stayed put, using the thick trunk of a cottonwood, taking pot shots that kept Eli pinned down. Eli knew he was in a stalemate. He couldn't stay here, but if he moved, he was an open target. And all the while, Clara was trapped in that flimsy cabin. He had to end it. Taking a deep breath, he burst from behind the barn, running in a low crouch toward the house. It was a desperate gamble. The gunman's rifle roared. Eli felt a sudden, searing pain in his left side, a fiery punch that stole his breath and sent him stumbling. He fell to one knee, the world tilting crazily, but his own gun was still in his hand. He brought it up, ignoring the black spots that danced in his vision, and fired twice. The second man cried out, clutched his chest, and slid down the trunk of the tree, leaving a dark smear on the bark. Silence. The sudden quiet was more deafening than the gunfire. The only sounds were the ringing in Eli's ears and his own ragged, painful breaths. He tried to stand, but his leg wouldn't obey. He looked down. A dark, ugly stain was spreading rapidly across the side of his shirt, soaking the fabric with a terrifying warmth. He pressed a hand to the wound, and a wave of dizziness washed over him. So profound he had to brace himself against the ground to keep from collapsing completely. The cabin door creaked open. Clara peered out, her face bone-white, her eyes wide with terror. She saw the 2 bodies by the trees, and then she saw Eli on the ground. "Eli!" His name was a strangled sob. She ran to him, heedless of any other danger. She knelt in the dirt beside him, her hands fluttering uselessly, not knowing what to do. "You're hurt," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh, God, you're hurt." "It's just a scratch," he grunted, the lie so obvious it was painful. He tried to push himself up again, a wave of agony contorting his features. "We have to get inside." Panic seized Clara, cold and paralyzing. Her mind screamed at her to run, to hide. This was what happened when you stayed. This was the violence she had spent her life trying to escape. But then she looked at Eli's face, pale and slick with sweat, his eyes clouded with pain but still fixed on her, trying to be strong for her. He had stood between her and this world's ugliness. Now, it was her turn. A new feeling, fierce and desperate, burned through the panic. It was bravery, born not from a lack of fear, but from a refusal to surrender to it. "All right," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "All right, we'll get you inside." She looped his arm over her shoulders, her small frame straining under his dead weight. He groaned, a low, guttural sound of pure pain, as she helped him lurch to his feet. Every step was a monumental effort. They stumbled toward the cabin, a desperate, hobbling pair. He was a strong man, solid muscle and bone, and she felt as if her own legs would buckle, but she held on, whispering words of encouragement that were as much for herself as for him. "We're almost there. Just a few more steps. I've got you." They collapsed through the doorway and onto the floor of the cabin. For a moment, they both lay there, gasping for breath. But there was no time to rest. He was bleeding too much, with a strength she did not know she possessed. Clara managed to drag him across the floor to the cot he used as a bed. "Stay still," she commanded, her voice taking on an authority that surprised them both. She flew into action. She bolted the door, then stoked the fire in the hearth, her mind racing. She put a kettle of water on to boil. She tore long strips from her own petticoat, her hands shaking so badly she could barely rip the fabric. She found his small flask of whiskey and a clean rag. She had seen her mother tend to wounds in the camp, but they had been cuts and scrapes, not this terrifying, bleeding hole. She gently cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. The wound was ugly, a ragged tear in the flesh high on his side, just below his ribs. It was still weeping blood, though not in the arterial spurts she had feared. She cleaned it as best she could with the hot water and whiskey, her touch surprisingly gentle. He gritted his teeth, his body rigid, a low hiss of pain escaping his lips. But he did not cry out. When the wound was clean, she packed it with a pad of cloth and bound his torso tightly with the strips she had torn, her makeshift bandage crude but firm. By the time she was finished, darkness had fallen completely. The only light in the cabin came from the flickering fire. Eli had passed out from the pain and blood loss, his face ashen, his breathing shallow. Clara sank to the floor beside his cot, her body trembling with exhaustion and the aftermath of terror. The two dead men were still outside. She pushed the thought away. They did not matter. Only he mattered. She refused to sleep. She pulled a small stool to his bedside and began her vigil. The hours of the night stretched into an eternity. She watched the slow rise and fall of his chest, her own breath catching every time his seemed to falter. The silence of the house was a living thing, filled with the ghosts of the gunfire and the specter of what could still be coming. To keep the fear at bay, to fill the terrible quiet, she began to talk. She whispered stories of her childhood, small, simple things. She told him about the stray dog she had befriended one summer, about the time she had learned to whistle from a friendly blacksmith, about the taste of the sweetgrass tea her mother used to make. They were insignificant memories, but they were all she had of a life before it had been broken. When her stories ran out, she began to sing. Her voice was soft and unsteady at first, a reedy thread of sound in the dark room. She sang the old lullabies her mother had sung to her, melodies of lost homelands and sleeping children. They were songs of comfort and safety. an invocation of a peace she had rarely known. She sang to him, to the flickering shadows, to the ghosts in the room, her voice a fragile shield against the vast, hostile darkness of the world outside. Sometime in the gray, pre-dawn hours, his eyes flickered open. He was looking at her, his gaze hazy with pain but lucid. His lips moved, but no sound came out. She leaned closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What is it?" she whispered. "Do you need water?" He swallowed, his throat working. When he spoke, his voice was a dry, rasping whisper. "In the dark, when the shooting started, I went down." He paused, gathering his strength. "It was all black, but I saw a light." His eyes focused on her face, and a profound, heartbreaking tenderness filled them. "It was you, Clara. You were the only thing I saw." A sob broke from her, a raw, ragged sound of grief and terror, and a love she hadn't even known she was capable of feeling. The tears she had held back all night came in a hot, blinding rush. She gripped his hand, her knuckles white. "Don't you die, Eli Thatcher," she wept, her voice fierce and pleading. "Don't you dare die. Please, don't leave me." He was not just her protector anymore. He was her anchor, her hope. The thought of being alone again, truly alone in this world, was a terror far greater than any gunman. He squeezed her hand weakly, his thumb tracing a small circle on her skin. He tried to sit up, wincing with the effort. "Not going anywhere," he whispered. She leaned over him, her tears dripping onto his face. And then, without thought, without hesitation, she lowered her head and pressed her lips to his. It was a tentative, desperate kiss, salty with her tears and tasting of fear and relief. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, aching connection. His lips were dry and cool, but they softened under hers, responding with a gentle pressure that spoke volumes. It was a promise, a plea, an acknowledgement of the fragile, powerful thing that had grown between them. The moment was shattered by a sound from outside. Hoofbeats. Not one horse, but several, moving at a steady, determined pace. They both froze, their eyes locking in shared alarm. The kiss was forgotten, replaced by the cold, sharp edge of immediate danger. More of them. Drayton's men, or maybe Drayton himself, coming to finish the job. "They're here," Eli rasped, trying to push himself up, his hand fumbling for the gun belt she had placed on the floor beside him. "No," Clara said, her mind racing. "You can't fight. Not like this. We have to run. We have to leave right now." I can't ride," he grunted, another wave of pain washing over him. "You will," she insisted, her fear forging itself into a will of iron. "I'll help you. There's a place. You told me about it. An old trapper's cabin, up in the cliffs. You said no one ever goes there." It was a desperate, half-formed plan, but it was the only one they had. The hoofbeats were getting closer. Clara ran to the back of the cabin, peering through a crack in the shutters. She could see them now. 3 riders, dark silhouettes against the rising sun. There was no more time for talk. She grabbed his gun belt and buckled it around his waist. She pulled his boots onto his feet. Then, with an effort that made her muscles scream in protest, she helped him to his feet. He leaned on her heavily, his face a mask of agony, but he did not complain. They staggered out the back door and toward the barn. Getting him onto Ghost's back was a nightmare. He was a dead weight, his body uncooperative with pain. But Clara refused to give up. She pushed, she pulled, she pleaded. And somehow, after a long, agonizing struggle, he was slumped over the saddle, barely conscious. She untied the horse, grabbed the reins, and with one last, terrified look at the cabin, she pulled herself up behind him. She wrapped one arm tightly around his waist to hold him steady, took the reins in her other hand, and kicked the horse into a desperate, lurching run. They fled into the broken, rocky country behind the ranch. just as the first of the riders came into view. They rode for hours, pushing deeper into the inhospitable cliffs and canyons. The trapper's cabin was little more than a hovel, a one-room shelter built into an overhang of rock, almost invisible from below. It was cold and damp, but it was hidden. She helped him slide from the horse and half carried, half dragged him inside, settling him on a dusty pile of old furs in the corner. He was barely conscious, his face burning with fever. She tended to his wound again, then built a small, smokeless fire and went to care for the horse. For 2 days, he drifted in and out of a fevered delirium. She was his constant shadow, bathing his face with cool water, forcing sips of broth between his lips, speaking to him in a low, soothing voice. She did not leave his side. On the 3rd evening, the fever broke. He woke to find her sitting beside him, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes were clear. The small cabin was warm and filled with the smell of brewing herbs. He looked at her, his heart swelling with a feeling so powerful it hurt. She had saved him. This girl, this child he had thought to protect, had dragged him from the jaws of death with nothing but her own grit and courage. That night, a fragile quiet settled in the small cabin. He was weak, but his mind was clear. The wall he had so carefully maintained between them, the line he had drawn to protect her honor, seemed absurd now. She had seen him at his most vulnerable, had tended to his bleeding body, had held him together with the sheer force of her will. She came to sit beside him on the furs, her presence a warm comfort in the cold stone shelter. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. He could feel the calluses on her palm, the strength in her grip. She looked at him, her gray eyes dark and serious in the firelight. "Eli," she said, her voice soft but steady. He watched her, his heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm. He knew what was coming, and his old code, his vow to himself, rose up in protest. He could not, he would not take what she offered out of gratitude or fear. "Clara," he started, his voice still rough. "You don't owe me anything. She put a finger to his lips, silencing him. She leaned in close, her gaze unwavering, holding him captive. There was no fear in her eyes now, no hesitation. There was only a quiet, resolute certainty. She had been bought and sold, traded and used. She had been an object, a possession, for as long as she could remember. But not anymore. In the fire of the last few days, something new had been forged inside her. She had found her own strength. She had made a choice. "You don't own me, Eli," she said, her voice a clear, soft bell in the quiet cabin. "You never did." She leaned closer still, her breath warm against his cheek. "But I choose you." Her words, "I choose you," were a key turning a lock deep inside him, opening a door to a room he had kept sealed for years. All his resolve, all the walls he had built to protect her from himself, crumbled under the quiet weight of her choice. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a responsibility or a ghost of his past, but as Clara, a woman of incredible, quiet strength whose own broken pieces seemed to fit against his. The night that followed was not one of passionate, reckless abandon. It was something far more profound. It was tender and hesitant, a slow, careful exploration of long-denied feelings. In the flickering firelight of the trapper's hovel, they came together not as a conqueror and the conquered, but as two equals, two survivors finding solace in each other's arms. Their movements were filled with unspoken wounds, a shared history of pain that made every touch both a question and an answer. There was an awkwardness to it, a fumbling reality that was more intimate than any practiced seduction. It was a joining of scars as much as skin. When he finally held her, it was with a reverence that bordered on pain. And when she held him back, it was with a fierce, possessive tenderness that declared he was finally, truly, hers. It was not perfect, but it was real. a fragile, beautiful thing built in the heart of the wilderness. In the days that followed, the small cabin became a sanctuary. As Eli's wound slowly began to heal, a new dynamic settled between them. The last vestiges of the master and the purchased girl were gone, replaced by a deep and comfortable partnership. Clara tended to him with a gentle efficiency, changing his bandages, making him savory broths from the rabbits she learned to trap. He, in turn, watched her with a quiet adoration that softened the hard lines of his face. The tremor in his hand seemed to lessen when she was near. They began to plan. The world outside their hidden cliffside was still dangerous, and Cold Drayton was still a shadow looming over them. They knew they could not stay here forever. "There's a valley, west of the mountains," Eli said one afternoon, his voice still weak but clear. He was sitting up, propped against the cabin wall, while Clara stitched a patch onto his spare shirt. "A friend of mine from the war settled there. He wrote to me once, said the soil is rich and the water runs clean all year, said a man could build a life there and be left alone." Clara looked up from her sewing, a hopeful light in her eyes. "Build a life," she repeated, the words sounding foreign and lovely on her tongue. "A real life," he affirmed, reaching out to take her hand. "A small ranch, some cattle, a garden." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "A home. With you." The possibility of it, the simple, beautiful dream, was a thing so precious she was almost afraid to touch it. A home. With him. It was more than she had ever allowed herself to hope for. They spent the next few days in a bubble of fragile optimism, making their plans. They would wait another week, until he was strong enough to ride for a full day without reopening his wound. Then they would leave this place, this territory of ghosts and violence, and head for the Western Valley. They would build something together. Their week of borrowed time ran out on the 6th day. The sky had been growing heavy, the air thick and charged. A storm was coming. Eli was now able to walk, albeit with a stiff, pained gait. He was outside, checking the shoes on Ghost in the small, lean-to stable attached to the cabin, when the sound of a dislodged rock from the trail below made him freeze. He looked up, his hand instantly on his Colt, his body tensing. It was too late. Before he could even draw his weapon, a man stepped out from behind a rock outcropping, a rifle leveled at Eli's chest. 2 more men appeared from the trail, flanking him, and then a 4th figure emerged, stepping into the clearing with a slow, arrogant swagger. He was a tall man, with a cruel, handsome face, and eyes as cold and dead as a snake's. A long scar ran down one side of his face, pulling his lip into a permanent sneer. Eli did not need to be told who he was. Cold Drayton. Well, Thatcher," Drayton said, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "Look at you, holed up in a cave like a wounded animal. I almost feel bad ending it like this." He looked past Eli, his eyes locking on the cabin door, where Clara had appeared, her face ashen with terror. "But I see you've kept my property safe for me. I appreciate that." One of his men moved with brutal speed, grabbing Clara before she could retreat, his hand clamped over her mouth to stifle her scream. She struggled, kicking and twisting, but he was too strong. "Let her go, Drayton!" Eli snarled, his voice a low growl of pure hatred. Drayton just laughed, a sound with no warmth in it. "You're in no position to be making demands." 2 of his men converged on Eli, disarming him and shoving him roughly into the small stable. They bound his hands tightly to a support post, pulling the rope so cruelly that his wounded side screamed in protest. He gritted his teeth, his eyes never leaving Drayton's face. Drayton dragged Clara over to the stable entrance so Eli would have a perfect view. She had stopped struggling, her body rigid with a fear so profound it was paralyzing. Her eyes were locked on Eli, wide and pleading. "You see, Thatcher," Drayton began, his voice dripping with sadistic pleasure as he circled Clara, tracing a finger down her cheek. She flinched as if struck. You've always had a hero problem. Always sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. You shot my brother in the back to save some worthless homesteader's wife. You took my sister's intended and left a hole in my family. And now you steal my merchandise. It's a bad habit. He looked at Clara, his eyes crawling over her with a possessive, appraising gaze. I was real disappointed when Silas told me he'd lost you. This one, she was special. Fetched a high price. The first time, I imagine she'll fetch an even higher one now that she's been broken in. He laughed again. I'll start the bidding in the next town myself. Maybe I'll even let the boys have a free sample first for all their hard work tracking you down. Eli strained against the ropes, his muscles screaming, a raw, inhuman sound of rage building in his throat. I'll kill you, Drayton, he roared. I don't think so, Drayton said calmly. You're going to die here, slowly, and you're going to watch while I take back what's mine. He leaned in close to Clara, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, but it was loud enough for Eli to hear every venomous word. Did he ever tell you where you came from, little bird? Did you ever wonder who plucked you from that miserable tinker's camp after your drunkard of a father died? It was me. I was the one who saw your potential. I was the one who sold you to that gambler. You have always, and will always, belong to me. Clara's world tilted on its axis. The revelation struck her with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. This man, this monster, was not just a new threat. He was the source, the beginning of her nightmare, the architect of her entire broken life. All the pain, all the fear, all the years of being less than human, all led back to the sneering face in front of her. Something inside her snapped. The terror that had frozen her in place shattered, replaced by a white-hot, incandescent rage. She was not that helpless, empty girl anymore. She was not property, and she would not go back. While Drayton was gloating, his attention fixed on Eli's tormented face, Clara's hand slowly, imperceptibly, moved to the small of her back, where she had taken to tucking the Derringer pistol Eli had given her. Her fingers closed around the small, pearl handle. She acted without a second thought. She twisted, jamming the small pistol into the gut of the man who was holding her and pulling the trigger. The shot was muffled, but sharp. The man grunted in surprise, his grip loosening as he staggered back, clutching his stomach. The world erupted into chaos. In that one moment of shocked surprise, Eli put every ounce of his strength into a single, desperate heave. The old wood of the support post groaned, and with a splintering crack, it gave way. He was free, though still bound at the hands. He lunged forward, tackling one of the other stunned henchmen, using his body as a weapon. The storm that had been threatening all day broke at that exact moment. The sky opened up, and a torrential rain began to fall, turning the hard-packed earth into a slick, churning sea of mud. Thunder cracked overhead, a deafening echo of the gunfire. Cole Drayton roared in fury, drawing his own pistol, but Clara was already scrambling away, disappearing into the blinding rain. Drayton turned his attention back to Eli, who was wrestling in the mud with the second henchman. Drayton aimed, but Ghost, terrified by the thunder and gunfire, kicked out from his stall, striking the third man and sending him sprawling. Eli managed to get his hands on a rock and brought it down hard on the head of the man he was fighting. He then lurched to his feet, his hands still bound, and charged at Drayton. He was running on pure, murderous adrenaline. Drayton fired, but his aim was spoiled by the slick mud under his feet. The bullet went wide before he could fire again. Eli slammed into him, and the two men went down, grappling in the mud and the rain. It was not a gunfight. It was a brutal, primal struggle, a battle of fists and teeth and raw hatred. Clara, hiding behind a rock, watched in horror. The man she had shot was trying to get to his feet. She knew she had to do something. With trembling hands, she reloaded the small, two-shot pistol. She took aim and fired again. The man went down for good. Meanwhile, Eli and Drayton rolled in the mud, each trying to gain the upper hand. Drayton was bigger and stronger, but Eli was fueled by a righteous fury that gave him inhuman strength. Drayton managed to pull a long-bladed knife from his belt. The blade flashed in the dim, stormy light. He slashed at Eli, opening a long, shallow cut on his arm. Eli ignored the pain. He saw Clara, her face a pale oval in the rain, saw the smoking pistol in her hand. He saw the future they had planned, the valley, the home, and he would not let this man take it from them. Drayton lunged, the knife aimed at Eli's heart. Eli twisted, and the blade plunged deep into his already wounded side. A blinding, sickening pain exploded through him. But in that moment, Drayton was overextended. Eli got his bound hands around Drayton's throat and squeezed. He put all of his pain, all of his grief for his sister, all of his love for Clara into that final, desperate act. Drayton's eyes bulged. He gasped for air, his hands scrabbling at Eli's. But Eli's grip was like iron. There was a sickening crack, and cold Drayton went limp. For a moment, Eli knelt there in the mud, over the body of his nemesis, the rain washing the blood and grime from his face. The fight was over. He had won. Then, the strength, the adrenaline, the rage, all fled his body at once, leaving behind only a vast, empty agony. The knife was still buried in his side. He looked down at it, a strange, detached curiosity on his face. He pulled it out, and the world dissolved into a dizzying vortex of gray. He collapsed into the mud, the rain falling on his upturned face. Clara screamed his name and ran to him, sliding to her knees in the slick, bloody mud. She turned him over, her hands frantic. The wound was horrific, far worse than the last one. Blood was pouring from it, a terrifying dark tide that the rain could not wash away. "Eli!" she sobbed, pressing her hands to the wound, a futile attempt to stem the flow. "No, no, no, you can't leave me." Her tears mixed with the rain on her face. She was no longer a brave fighter. She was a terrified girl about to lose the only person who had ever truly seen her. "Please, Eli," she begged, her voice breaking. "Don't go. Please don't go." His eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with pain, but they found her, and they were filled with a love so profound it stole her breath. He lifted a trembling, muddy hand and touched her cheek, his fingers leaving a smear of dirt on her skin. His lips moved, and she had to lean down, pressing her ear to his mouth to hear his whispered words over the roar of the storm. "I bought your freedom," he rasped, his voice a bare thread of sound. He took a shallow, rattling breath. "But your love, that's something I'd die for." His hand fell from her face, and his eyes slid closed. He went limp in her arms, a dead weight, and Clara threw back her head and howled her grief into the unforgiving storm. The first thing Eli knew was the absence of pain, for what felt like an eternity. He had been adrift in a sea of fire and darkness, a place where his only anchor was the memory of mud and rain and Clara's desperate, sobbing face. Now, there was only a dull, distant ache and a profound, bone-deep stillness. The second thing he knew was a sound, a soft, rhythmic murmur that had been a constant presence in the dark. It was a voice, speaking low and gentle, sometimes humming a nameless tune. He forced his eyelids open. They felt impossibly heavy, caked with the sleep of the dead. The light was soft, filtered through a clean, lace curtain. He was not in the trapper's hovel. He was in a real room, a clean room that smelled of carbolic soap and dried lavender. He lay on a soft bed with crisp, white sheets. His side was heavily bandaged, the wrappings stark against his skin. He turned his head, a slow, stiff movement that cost him a great deal of effort. She was there, Clara. She was asleep in a wooden armchair pulled tight against his bedside, her head resting on the edge of his mattress. Her face was pale and thin, with dark, bruised-looking circles under her eyes. But she was peaceful. One of her hands was resting on top of his on the coverlet, a small, warm weight that felt more real than anything else in the room. The voice he had been hearing was hers. She had been talking to him, singing to him, even in her sleep. He lay there for a long time, just watching her, a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to break him, washing over his weak body. She had done this. She had kept him tethered to the world. A floorboard creaked, and an older man with kind, weary eyes and a fringe of gray hair entered the room. He wore spectacles and a clean apron. He saw Eli was awake, and a small, relieved smile touched his lips. "Well now," the man said quietly, so as not to wake Clara. "Look who decided to rejoin the living. I'm Dr. Finch, and you, son, are one of the luckiest men I've ever had the displeasure of patching up." Eli's throat was dry as dust. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse croak came out. The doctor brought him a cup of water, helping him take a few sips. "Where?" Eli managed to rasp. "You're in my house, in the town of Harmony," the doctor explained. "That young lady, she's a miracle, that one. She rode in here 3 days ago with you slung over your horse, more dead than alive. She'd kept you alive with nothing but desperation and clean rags, refused to leave your side since, barely eaten, barely slept, just sits there, holding your hand and talking to you." At the sound of the doctor's voice, Clara stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, hazy with sleep. They found Eli's, and for a moment, she just stared, as if not believing what she was seeing. Then, her expression crumpled, and a single, perfect tear rolled down her cheek. "Eli?" she whispered, her voice thick with sleep and emotion. The simple sound of his name was a prayer, an affirmation, a joyous welcome. He squeezed her hand, a feeble movement, but it was enough. "Clara," he said, his own voice rough. In that moment, the doctor, the room, the world, all fell away. There was only the two of them, looking at each other across a chasm of pain and fear they had somehow, impossibly, crossed together. Over the next few days, as Eli's strength slowly returned, the rest of the story pieced itself together. News traveled fast in the West, and the tale of the shootout at the old ranch had become something of a local legend. Sheriff Brody arrived on the second day of Eli's consciousness. He stood at the foot of Eli's bed, his hat in his hands, looking at Eli with a newfound respect. "Thatcher," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Figured I'd find you here. The doc sent word." He cleared his throat. "I rode out to the ranch, found Drayton and his men. The territory has had a $500 bounty on Cole Drayton's head for the last 3 years. Seems he was wanted for everything from robbery to murder in 3 territories. Eli just stared at him, saying nothing. "The point is," Brody continued, "no one is shedding any tears for that man or his crew. As far as the law is concerned, you did this territory a favor. The bounty is yours, if you want it. More importantly, your name is clear. You're not a wanted man. Thatcher, you're a hero." The word hung in the air, foreign and ill-fitting. Hero. Eli felt a bitter laugh rise in his throat. He was a man who had gotten his sister killed, a man whose past was a trail of blood and violence. He was no hero. He was just the man who had survived. But the town of Harmony did not see it that way. As Eli recovered, people would stop by the doctor's house with small gifts: a fresh-baked pie, a jar of preserves, a book of poems. They were quiet, respectful people, farmers and merchants who had lived in fear of men like Cole Drayton. They looked at Eli with a kind of awe, and at Clara with a gentle, protective kindness. Dr. Finch's wife, Martha, a warm, bustling woman with a heart as big as the plains, took a particular liking to Clara. She saw past the girl's ragged dress and haunted eyes to the sharp mind and gentle spirit within. One afternoon, while Eli was sleeping, Martha sat with Clara on the porch swing, "The town is looking for a new teacher for the schoolhouse," Martha said, her knitting needles clicking softly. "The last one got married and moved back east. It's not much, just a one-room building. But the children are good children. They need someone to teach them their letters and their numbers, someone patient and kind." She paused, looking at Clara with a knowing smile. "Someone like you." Clara was stunned into silence. A teacher, her, a life of books and chalk dust, of children's laughter and quiet, respectable days. It was a fantasy so far beyond the scope of her imagination that she could not even process it. She thought of her mother, who had taught her to read by tracing letters in the dirt with a stick. The idea of standing in front of a room of children, of giving them the gift of knowledge, was both terrifying and achingly beautiful. I couldn't," Clara stammered. "I have no training. I have nothing." "You have a good head on your shoulders and a kind heart," Martha said firmly. "That's more than half the job right there. We can provide you with the books, and a room at the boarding house. You could have a life here. Clara, a real peaceful life." The offer settled in Clara's heart. A seed of impossible hope. A life, a town, a purpose. It was everything she had never dared to dream of. Eli saw the change in her. He saw the way she looked at the schoolhouse when they took their first slow walks through the town. He saw the way her face lit up when a small child waved to her. He heard her talking with Martha about books and lessons. He saw her beginning to unfurl, like a flower that had been trapped in the dark and was finally seeing the sun. And as he watched her, a cold, painful certainty grew in his own heart. He was a part of her old life, the life of violence and fear and running. He was the man with blood on his hands, the man who had brought Cole Drayton down upon them. He was a ghost, a remnant of the wilderness. She belonged here, in the sun, in this peaceful town, with a future that was clean and bright and had no place for a broken cowboy like him. He loved her. He knew that now, with a certainty that was as solid and real as the ground beneath his feet. And because he loved her, he had to let her go. It was the only truly good and noble thing he could do for her, to untether her from his past and set her free to have the future she so richly deserved. He made his plan in the quiet of the night, while she slept peacefully in the small guest room across the hall. His wound was mostly healed, a thick, ugly scar that pulled at his side. But he was strong enough to ride. Dr. Finch had refused any payment, calling Eli's recovery payment enough. Sheriff Brody had left the bounty money with the doctor, and Eli took a small portion of it, just enough to get him started somewhere new. He left the rest for Clara. He wrote her a short, clumsy letter, the words feeling like stones in his throat. He told her she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. He told her she deserved the sun, and that he would love her until the day he died. He left the letter on her pillow, a silent, cowardly goodbye. At the first hint of dawn, while the town was still shrouded in a gray, misty silence, he slipped out to the livery. He saddled Ghost, his movements quiet and deliberate. Every step felt like a betrayal, a tearing of his own soul. But he held firm. This was for her. He mounted his horse and rode slowly down the town's main street, a solitary figure in the pre-dawn gloom. He did not look back. He couldn't. He had just reached the edge of town, where the neat houses gave way to the open, dusty road, when he saw her. She was standing in the middle of the road, a lone, determined figure in a simple borrowed dress. She was not crying. Not yet. Her arms were crossed over her chest, and her chin was lifted in that stubborn way he knew so well. She had known, somehow, she had known he would try to run. He pulled Ghost to a stop, his heart a heavy, aching weight in his chest. He had no words. What could he possibly say? She walked toward him slowly, her eyes fixed on his, when she was standing right beside his horse. She looked up at him, and he finally saw the tears glistening in her eyes, threatening to spill over. "You think you can just leave?" she said, her voice quiet, but shaking with a fierce, wounded anger. You think you can make that choice for me? After everything? Clara, he started, his voice thick. You deserve this. A good life. A peaceful one. I can't give you that. I'm what I am. All I bring is trouble. You're wrong, she said, her voice growing stronger. You brought me here. You showed me what it was to be treated like a person. You taught me how to be brave. You think a life here, a peaceful life, would mean anything without you in it? It would just be another kind of empty. He shook his head, the old, familiar guilt twisting inside him. I'm no good for you. You see a hero. I see the man who failed his sister. I see the man who almost got you killed. Tears were now streaming freely down her face, but her gaze never wavered. She reached up and put her hand on his leg, her touch a searing brand through his denims. You never owned my heart, she said, her voice clear and ringing in the morning quiet. But you earned it. The words struck him with the force of a physical blow, shattering the last of his defenses, the last of his guilt-ridden, self-sacrificing notions. Earned it. It was not a debt of gratitude. It was not a payment for her freedom. It was something he had won, something he deserved, something that was freely, truly given. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a real, genuine smile broke across Eli Thatcher's face. It was a slow, unfamiliar thing, but it reached his eyes, crinkling their corners and filling them with a light she had never seen before. Without another word, he lifted his hands from the saddle horn and let the leather reins drop from his fingers. They fell against Ghost's neck with a soft thud. He was letting go of the running, the loneliness, the past. Then I guess I'm staying, he said. They did not stay in harmony. The town was kind, but the ghosts were still too close. A few days later, they rode back to the abandoned ranch, the bounty money in their saddlebags. But this time, they were not running to it as a hiding place. They were returning to it as a destination. The work was hard. The house was dilapidated, the fences broken, the land overgrown. But they worked together. He taught her how to hammer a nail straight and how to reshingle a roof. She taught him which wild plants were good for stew and which were good for tea. They cleared the land, patched the walls, and rebuilt the corral. Every swing of the hammer, every newly planted fence post, was an act of creation, a defiant statement against the forces of destruction that had defined their lives. They were not running from pain anymore. They were finally building something together. One evening, months later, they sat before the hearth in their newly repaired home. A cold autumn wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, a familiar sound of the vast, unforgiving wilderness they had both survived. But inside, the fire was warm and bright, casting a golden glow on the room. Eli was sitting in a chair he had mended, and Clara was curled on a rug at his feet, her head resting against his knee. His hand was resting on her hair, his fingers gently stroking the corn silk strands. A profound peace filled the small room, a quiet, comfortable silence that was more eloquent than any words. The house was no longer a tomb of past sorrows. It was a home filled with the warmth of a new and hard-won life. And for the first time, in the heart of the wild and beautiful West, both of them felt like they truly belonged. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. And be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.